Alright, welcome back. You are here with Martin Goldberg. Today I want to talk about a subject that I might be migrating this and others to the written word because I feel like it's a little bit more impervious to Google's shenanigans. But at any rate, a very common trope or notion, talking point in our society, which I guess you could source to the supply side people on the economic and political spectrum, is that pensions for employees are unsustainable. They're unfunded. They have to be eliminated. Why, after all, would any company pay someone who's no longer being productive in their retirement years? And on paper, it makes sense, but what's actually interesting, I was reading the book Retirement Heist, which is extraordinarily well researched on this subject. And as it turns out, a lot of these pension funds were doing fine. It was simply the fact that those companies at the top, the executives figured, we can take that money and play around with it for our own benefit. So if we look at some of the figures here in the late 90s, GE's pension had a surplus of 25 billion, Verizon 24 billion, at&t 20 billion, IBM was 7 billion. And yet we kept hearing how it can't be done, we can't sustain them. So what they started to do is they would take the positive returns out of pension funds and they would apply that to their annual earnings, to the point where certain companies like US Steel and Boeing, they were calculating that without that calculation, their earnings would have been 20 or 30% less. And another thing they've been doing is taking those funds out of the employee pension calculations and using it towards executive perks, which are actually not funded. This is the funny thing because you say, well, the pensions aren't funded. As it turns out, it's actually the executive pay, which in many cases is not the one that has any money behind it. Another thing they'll do is they'll take pension earnings from particular years and then spread them out to future years when the company they fear might not have as good performance on the stock market. They call it like amortization. And what's interesting is that if you look at some of the facts, when it came to GE under Immelt and he was eliminating the pension program, they said the liability for executive pensions, not for employees, executives, was $4.4 billion. But they're trying to pretend that it was the employee one that was dragging everything. It kind of gives you a little bit more perspective here. And so if we continue looking at some of the examples, Ron Perelman, he took over Revlon in 1985, specifically rated $100 million in pension surpluses. A lot of these companies, instead of seeing the pensions as essentially, we put that aside for people who have been contributing, they're like, no, we can use that to boost our profitability and help our stock. You had U.S. Airways when it decided to transfer its pensions to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. This guy, Dennis Waldron, retired as a pilot. He was making $19.39 a month in pension. That went down to $95, and this is what you'll see them do. They will squander the money and then kick it to the government's insurance corporation, and people end up getting shaved because that does not guarantee anything more but a certain percentage. IBM removed pension calculator from their website to hide the fact that they were making cuts, and you had individual employees who were doing these calculations and calling them out because they were trying to prevent people from realizing that they had changed the original terms of the plan without informing them. Or they'll inform them with very clean, politically correct language to where a lot of folks don't realize it. And this comes back to what I was talking about in another video of the stock market driving earnings as opposed to earnings driving the stock price. So a lot of companies are more interested in trying to get their earnings report good so that their stock goes up as opposed to necessarily being actually profitable. A great way to boost your financial profile is make cuts. And it's sad, but that's how things have proceeded forward. Other things that these companies have started doing is, as was the case of Lucent, which is a spin-off of at&t, they told employees, if you're not dead by this point, we're going to take away your survivor benefits for other people. Or companies sending out notices to retirees saying, you have to get a sworn affidavit, notarized, proving you're alive, submit tax returns, a marriage license. In other words, hoping that they're not going to follow through and they'll lose their pensions, which were promised under previous agreements. Another thing that you saw with this company, Verity, they decided to, in order to not have to pay for pensions, and the CEO was caught red-handed saying this, they created a subsidiary, put all the pensions they didn't want to pay for in that, and told people, hey, transfer to this new plan, which 1,500 or so did. On the first day, this company had a negative net worth of like $50 million. So it was deliberately set up to ensure that the pensions wouldn't be paid out. Another thing you see them doing is they will raise healthcare premiums to the point where it eclipses pensions. And we're not talking about, someone who is like making $100,000 a year. We're talking about someone making maybe $300 or $400 a year, a retired tradesman or miner, and then you raise their health premiums to the point where essentially they are paying to be retired as opposed to just collecting that benefit. So it is kind of ridiculous. With Omnicom, the CEO got a pension COLA. Employees, of course, did not. GE, this is at another point, owed $5.9 billion in retirement. AT&T's Whitaker, they kept him on a retainer of $1 million a year for 3 years of consulting, and he walked away with a $158 million payout, whilst at the same time they're cutting other people's pensions and retirement. So it's not to say that, everyone's sacrificing. They say, we have ownership society, you have a 401k, you fund your own retirement. The CEOs aren't doing that, though. Their money, their compensation is not funded. So essentially, you have employees that are footing the bill for the CEOs. And Goldman Sachs admitted in 2006 the most important contributor to higher profit margins over the past 5 years has been a decline in labor's share of national income. And now some of you are going to say, well, if you look at the kind of classic Milton Friedman argument, the CEO has more value than the employee, that's why they get paid more money. But let's put that to the test for a second. Carly Fiorina. I like her, I know her as a person, she's a wonderful woman, but as a actual manager, she was horrible at HP. She walked away with like $20 million. After being a failure, she got $20 million. You guys might have remembered Greg with 2 G's, Steinhoffel, the head of Target. He was in charge for 2 things, the data breach, and then he oversaw the expansion into Canada, which was completely disastrous. They closed every store there. When the data breach happened shortly after he resigned, now he's cost the company a lot of money. What happened? He ended up with a $55 million parachute whilst they were cutting hours and benefits for existing hourly employees. So you can't really say, well, if you perform well, you get rewarded. No, you could perform terribly, but if you're an executive, you will still be paid. And then, of course, Don Blankenship with the Massey Coal Company, they were doing mountaintop removal when he was in charge, which is estimated to have put like 300 million gallons of toxic substances into freshwater supplies. You also had the Upper Big Branch mine disaster, which killed a bunch of working class people. And he got $12 million in cash, $27 million in deferred compensation, and then a pension of like $5 million. On top of that, he was allowed to live rent-free in a company house, and the company paid to put a pipeline in to deliver clean water to his house. And you say, yeah, but he got a year in prison. I think most people would take a year in prison to walk away with $50 million and essentially a slap on the wrist. So it's not to say that capitalism is all bad, but I think whenever we hear these stupid arguments of you're either, pro any corporation or you're a democratic socialist, you're Bernie Booty Boy, that needs to stop because it's not helpful. This is not companies, that's just the free market. This is companies deliberately raiding commitments with retirement they made in the past in order to fund executives who may not have even done a good job. My view is you pay the executive an existing salary when they're in there, but all this deferred compensation, stock options, whatnot, that becomes excessive, and it's honestly the reason why oftentimes people are losing their pensions. It's not because they're unsustainable, it's because the companies are choosing to use those funds for other things that are really questionable. Does someone really need $100 million walking away, especially if they've done a terrible job? That should be an open question. That should be something that conservatives, libertarians should not be afraid of looking at that and should stop excusing, in my view. Because, unfortunately, people lose their retirement and whatnot, it increases the likelihood they end up on government welfare. And that's not a good thing.